latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion. There's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. So Sarah Sanders deigned to go on Meet the Press with little Chucky Todd over the weekend, and Todd's panties were all in a bunch over Trump's delegation of materials to declassify to Attorney General Barr. He certainly was taking up the line of argumentation for his brothers-in-arms, Clapper and Comey and, of course, Brennan and so many others. And the question was, is the president preordaining the outcome of the Barr-directed investigation? Is he trying to wire it for a result that he wants, or is he willing to accept whatever Attorney General Barr and U.S. Attorney Durham and U.S. Attorney Huber and DOJ IG Horowitz come up with?
So the president is not going to accept exoneration if that's what Bill Barr finds?
Look, I'm not going to get ahead of what the final conclusion is, but we already know that there was a high level of corruption that was taking place. We've seen that in the IG investigation that's already happened, but there's a lot more there that we still need to know, and we're going to let the Attorney General do his job.
Well, it sounds like you're not. That's my point. It doesn't sound like you want him to do his job. It sounds like the president has already determined the outcome.
Chuck, that's the reason that he's granted the Attorney General the authority to declassify that information, to look at all the documents necessary, is so that we can get to the very bottom of what happened. Once again, we already know about some wrongdoing. The president's not wrong in that, but he wants to know everything that happened and how far and how wide it went. We know that there was corruption. Let's see.
Does he expect criminal charges? Does he expect, he's accused James Comey of treason. Does he expect Jim Comey to be arrested?
Again, we're going to let the Attorney General make that determination as he gets to the conclusion of this investigation.
So the president,
but we
he's
certainly
not going to
expect the people that were responsible and that were part of this unprecedented obstruction and corruption at the FBI, those people should certainly be held responsible and be held accountable, and the president expects that to take place.
Yeah, and Chuck Todd very frustrated because he wanted Sarah Sanders to agree that the president will not necessarily accept the results of any Barr-directed investigation unless it turns up the results that he wants, which is not anything that she was saying. The president can have his opinion about what Jim Comey did or didn't do and about what level it rises to with respect to potential criminality. But the whole point is he can bloviate on Twitter all he wants. Attorney General Barr is going to direct this investigation, and you either believe that that will be done professionally and in pursuant to where the facts lead, or you don't. And, of course, Chuck Todd doesn't, because that's the position of the D.C. press corps, and so it's one he must prosecute no matter the evidence. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Ed Morrissey, senior editor for HotAir.com and columnist for The Week. Ed, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
How did you receive the reactions from the D.C. press corps and from all of the potential targets in these concurrent investigations to Trump's decision to empower Barr with that declassification EO?
Well, I'm a little confused as to why this is, why people are leaping to the conclusion that this is going to produce a particular result other than just the declassification. Presidents have more or less a plenary authority to deal with classification and declassification, and that means that they can structure that process how they see fit. And the Attorney General is somebody he runs a department that produces intelligence. So does the CIA. So does so do military intelligence agencies. The NSA, for instance, is a military intelligence agency. They're all producers of intelligence, and so anybody who sits at the top of those chains is well qualified to deal with intelligence matters. That includes the Attorney General. Now, it's a little unusual. Normally, you might, in the structure that we currently have, post 9/11, you might task that to the Director of National Intelligence, which would be Dan Coates in this particular case. but it isn't that unusual to say that the Attorney General in this particular case should do that, especially since the FBI seems to be at the center of this issue.
Well, do you think there's a possibility that the FBI was spying on the Trump campaign?
Were they spying on the Trump campaign? Well, if you're conducting surveillance by putting people in as embeds by misrepresenting themselves, I mean, that is a classic counter-espionage tactic. And counter-espionage is, by definition, spying. The question isn't whether they were being spied on. The question is whether it was sufficiently predicated. We have the FISA law in order to control that. In FISA's Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and that was passed after it became clear that the FBI was doing an awful lot of domestic espionage work, and Congress passed the FISA law to limit and control that. And so you're supposed to have a sufficient predicate to know that somebody is operating, a U.S. person is operating as a foreign agent on U.S. soil in order to get a warrant to conduct that type of operation. And they did. They got a FISA warrant for Carter Page. The question is whether it was sufficiently predicated, whether or not the FBI misrepresented the information to the FISA court. So I think the question of whether there was spying going on, I think that is almost besides the point. The question is whether or not the FBI even had a good reason to conduct any sort of counter-espionage activity against members of the Trump campaign.
In addition to that, I mean, you got to be sort of gobsmacked by the indifference that Democrats have and their handmaidens in the D.C. press corps to the conduct of CIA and FBI bosses. I mean, these are agencies they're normally a healthy level of skepticism associated with because of their power. And whether you think Comey and Brennan and Clapper perjured themselves or committed any other crimes or not, certainly their conduct is a legitimate source of inquiry. And also the question, how many more like them are at FBI and CIA where they're using their positions to advance a particular political worldview? And isn't that a problem? Because, hey, guess what? If your people are out of power, then they could be the next targets. What if Trump did with intelligence agencies and law enforcement what was done in 2016 against him in 2020 against your nominee? Would you take an interest then?
See, this is the point where I really am more mystified than anything else. This is clearly something that can be a problem. It can be a very the potential for a lot of abuse of power. And so even if you're inclined to think that nothing untoward happened, just the fact that the FBI took that step and then came up with nothing at the end of that, that should prompt a significant investigation. Because, again, if you get that FISA warrant, you are representing to that court that you're not going through normal law enforcement procedures because you're convinced that this person is a foreign agent acting in a hostile manner, and you can't use normal law enforcement procedures to deal with it. Because there's also law enforcement that you can use to deal with law enforcement laws to deal with espionage. I mean, you can just arrest somebody for espionage. It's a criminal act. This was not a law enforcement investigation, which has all sorts of different kinds of controls on it. It was a counterintelligence operation, which doesn't have those controls except for the FISA court. And the fact that they never had an indictment against Carter Page, and that Carter Page's activities never appear as any sort of element in any of the indictments that have been issued by the Department of Justice or the special counsel, that is a big, huge red flag that there's something that went wrong. And that requires, and it should require, everybody should agree on this, that we make sure that there wasn't any abuse of this process, any sort of politicization of this process, because if there was, and it comes out and nothing was done about it, that FISA law is going to get repealed eventually, and then the FBI is going to be left pretty much defenseless in dealing with counterintelligence operations or intelligence operations aimed against the United States inside the United States. It's a very dangerous thing.
So if the left is going to make 2020 about cultural shaming and conspiracy theories around Trump, you got to pretty much like his chances, don't you?
Well, I think you got to like his chances for a number of reasons. Actually, I mean, the economy is very strong. The models for the economy normally would point to a fairly strong reelection. I think Donald Trump's negatives sort of weigh down on that. But you've got two columnists in the last 4 or 5 days at the New York Times that are sending up warning flags. This guy's going to get reelected. Steve Ratner, who is a former Treasury Secretary for Barack Obama, and Bret Stephens have both written columns at the New York Times in the last few days saying this guy's going to get reelected. And Ratner is talking about the economy, and Stevens is talking more about what you're talking about the left's inflexibility and their inability to connect to voters. I think that, I think you got to like the chances if this continues.
And Biden's not it. Well, he took 10 days off. He's returning valiantly to the campaign trail today. I don't know if you've heard.
Yeah, Joe Biden is running the sort of the missing man campaign. He's running the Fred Thompson campaign. Fred Thompson, God bless his soul.
That didn't work out very well.
He wanted to run that campaign, but they have made the intelligent calculation that the less people see of Joe Biden, the better off he's going to be.
Right, but with respect to Stevens and Ratner and the New York Times, the problem is they're being drowned out not just by fellow op-ed writers at the Washington Post and Salon.com who are hell-bent on impeachment, but by the rabble-rousers in Nancy Pelosi's caucus who are similarly hell-bent on impeachment, and that will continue to make the focus and, frankly, the central offering of the Democrats, this impeachment theater they're doing combined with banning plastic straws.
And again, I think that gets back to what Bret Stephens is writing about, is that the left is really kind of disconnected from the voters. They're listening to themselves. They're kind of immersed in their own bubble. And that's the reason. And it's not just in this country; it's around the world. Which is the point that Stephens was making, is that you have this right-wing populism that is surging because the left has become so inflexible and so disconnected that they feel that their own that people should just recognize their genius and vote for them rather than connect with people and find out what they're about. And I think that that's a very powerful trend, and it works in Donald Trump's favor.
Do you agree with me that the greatest threat right now to Trump's reelection is Trump's trade policy?
Well, normally I agree with you, Dan.
That's all right. You can disagree.
Like to agree with you.
That's all right.
But
go ahead.
I think that's one threat. I suspect that that's going to get resolved because everybody wants to make money, and I think that that's going to be recent. I really honestly still think that the biggest threat to Donald Trump's reelection is Donald Trump's mouth. Mm-hmm. And I think it was the biggest threat to his election in 2016. It has to do with the fact that he's not a very likable person. And it's sort of like a Biden situation. The more people hear from Donald Trump, the more they find things that will irritate or alienate themselves from him. His policies are working very well. The economy's great. And I think when he focuses on that and talks about that, that's where he's best off. But I don't think the trade policy is going to be as big of a problem unless Trump really just doesn't want to solve it. And I think that's really up to him.
All right. Ed Morrissey, senior editor for HotAir.com, columnist for the week, making his final appearance on Morning Answer because he disagreed with me. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding, Ed.
It's been a great run, though. It's been a great run.
Yeah.
Ed, thanks for joining us. I always appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care. Enjoyed our time with you.
Yeah,
he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago.